I remember I was sitting in the Situation Room briefing the national security staff on one of the latest operations and espionage campaigns, and felt like people weren't getting it.
This is Code and Country Part 2, the Dmitri Alperovitch episode.
So you referenced the book already, which is called World on the Brink, and it lays out really a whole of society strategy for how the U.S. can beat China in the race for the 21st century. I mean, I think that you've laid out the backstory, but I guess what pushed you to write this now, and how have people reacted to that book coming out?
You know, one of the themes of my life that hopefully is coming across, and hopefully came across in the book, is that I've just been incredibly lucky to have had some amazing opportunities. We talked about one of getting into the cyber field early on, and in the one area where you had the opportunity to learn probably the most at the time of any others in terms of rapid evolution of the threat and the importance of all these technologies, forensics, intelligence, telemetry, cloud, etc. The other one, of course, being able to leave Russia and immigrate to the United States. The third one being involved in one of the earliest investigations of espionage activity, nation-state espionage activity, with the Google hack. But the other one is being at the forefront of this confrontation between the United States and China before most people really appreciated that this was a new Cold War, that I believe this is. And the cyber domain really gave you front seat to that issue more than virtually any other, right? And I remember in these early investigations in the 2010, 2011 days is what really pulled me into the national security circles in a very deep way. After Aurora, I was briefing the State Department. After Shady Rat and others, I was briefing the White House. I remember I was sitting in the Situation Room briefing the national security staff on one of the latest operations and espionage campaigns, and felt like people weren't getting it, right? I felt almost like Khrushchev wanted to ban the table of the sit room, of like, guys, they're ripping us blind. They're stealing our secrets. They're stealing our IP. They're stealing our economic advantage. This is war. This is not a hot war, but certainly a cold war. And, getting the reaction of like, oh, Dmitri, you're being so naive. This is just what they're doing to try to, get on the global stage as a developed country. And by the way, as long as they keep stealing, they can't innovate, which was just so ahistorical and ridiculous in retrospect. And of course, you look now and China's leading in battery technologies, EVs, telecommunications, all these different industries where they did steal a ton, and yet they still innovated and now have the best of the best. But it gave me that front row seat to the struggle before I think a lot of people in other parts of national security circles got to appreciate it. So I became very early believer that China is an adversary and that this is a Cold War. And the more I was doing investigations, particularly on the national security side of espionage activity, and particularly in Southeast Asia, the more I got to appreciate the threat that Taiwan was facing of a potential invasion from China, and how focused they were on this issue, and how much of their espionage was directed at that problem, whether it's against U.S. military or against our allies in the region. But also, my Russian background came in very helpful in 2021 when I was focused on China at the time, and looking now at the broader competition and what we need to do on technology, what we need to do in cyber, having founded Silverado, our nonprofit that is focused on accelerating policy in Washington primarily on these issues. And then sort of with the corner of my eye, keeping an eye on Russia, the country of my birth, the country I understand very well, and having been looking very carefully at Putin's rise back from 1999 and throughout his career. And now seeing in the fall of 2021 that something very different was happening. It began with the massive buildup of troops on the Ukrainian border, but then watching carefully Putin's statements and how he was approaching in a very non-serious way these negotiations with the United States to try to defuse the issue. And I made a very public prediction on Twitter that this invasion was going to take place, and it was going to take place before the end of that winter, and outline all the reasons why I believe that, about almost 3 months before the start of the conflict. And just became absolutely convinced that he was going to embark on this ruinous conflict. And when the war began on February 24th, February 22, 2024, even though I was completely convinced for 3 months it was going to happen, it was still a shock, right? Even when you expect something and you know it's going to happen, when it does. And, I was talking, of course, to friends in Kiev and others who were, living under the barrage of rocket and missile fire, and the bombing campaigns from the Russian Air Force, getting videos from them, seen snippets on Telegram and the like. It was a very shocking day. And I remember sort of stepping away from the computer. I was up all night. The invasion began the night before. And sort of thinking for a few hours about going back to my prediction of why was I so confident it was going to happen, what led to it, and realizing that the factors that convinced me that Putin was going to invade Ukraine were exactly the same factors that were playing out in the Indo-Pacific that I believe were driving Xi to want to invade Taiwan in his lifetime. And that's when the story of the book actually began, when I realized that another war is coming, even more devastating than this one. But unlike the Russia-Ukraine war, which I think was too late to stop at the time that I and others became convinced it was going to happen, here we have time. China is not invading this year. It's not invading next year. We have some years, I think probably at least 3 to 5 years, maybe 7, before they launch this war, and they're deterrable. This is very difficult to pull off, much harder than Ukraine even is for Russia, and obviously Russia hasn't succeeded in Ukraine. And there's an opportunity to, A, raise awareness about this threat that I think a lot of people are not paying attention to, and 2, have policy pronouncements that we can build support for what needs to be done to ultimately, A, deter the conflict over Taiwan, but B, also make sure that we win the broader Cold War and the race for the 21st century.
So that sense of urgency really comes through from the book. I mean, it feels like the window's closing fast. And there's some compelling arguments that you make in World on the Brink that the U.S. still has the upper hand, but time is short. What would you say is the most urgent warning that you're hoping Washington will heed?
Well, so as I mentioned, I believe that the timing of these two conflicts, right, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Xi's desire to invade Taiwan, is not coincidental, right? Both of these men who have full control of their countries, who have full control of the decision making, right? It's their decision and their decision alone to launch these wars. They're both in their 70s. Putin has been in power for 26 years now. She's been in power since 2012. Both of them have extended terms in an unprecedented fashion and changed laws to enable them to stay in power. But both of them are facing the twilight of their careers, potentially their lives, right? And I think Putin very much came out of COVID worried about his mortality. We've all seen the memes of the lawn tables, right? Staying far away from anyone. He was very much afraid of getting sick, and thinking that, about succession. He's actually, in the last week, admitted that he spends a lot of time thinking about succession, right? But also, I think, thinking about his legacy and unfinished business. And I think Ukraine was that biggest chunk in his mind of what he hadn't yet done, which is why the urgency to do this now versus waiting more time. And I think the same dynamic is playing out with Xi, where he wants to be a leader who is going to go down into the pantheon of Chinese history as someone who's greater than Mao, who has accomplished more than Mao has, and particularly accomplished the one thing that Mao couldn't do, which is take Taiwan, right? Which Xi now calls the key piece of the key factor that leads to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that needs to be done by 2049. 2049, of course, would be the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. But I'm convinced that he's not thinking this can wait till 2049. He is thinking this needs to be done on my watch. I'm going to be 72 this year. I'm going to go up for a re-election in 2027 for an unprecedented fourth term, which is going to be a 5-year term that runs out in 2032 when I'm going to be 79. Who knows if I can get another term then? Who knows? Health concerns, etc., may interfere. So I think he's thinking about that 5-year term, 27 through end of 27, really. So pretty much 28 through 32, as his last, right? And sometime in that period, conditions dependent, he hasn't penciled a date certain in the calendar. I think he wants to do it. And that's what I think people need to pay attention to, that this is coming. And the effects of that conflict will be devastating for everyone, not just the United States, not just obviously Taiwan and China itself, but for the global economy. I mean, the estimates are that even a blockade of Taiwan can throw the world into global depression and cut 5% of global GDP right off the bat. A prolonged conflict that destroys the semiconductor manufacturing facilities in Taiwan. They're responsible for 40% of the world's chip production and over 90% of the world's most advanced chip production, would have huge and very long-lasting effects. Of course, the overall trade that goes through the Taiwan Strait in that region is enormous, right? So no country, no person in the world is going to be untouched by this one way or another. And that is why it's so imperative to do everything in our power to try to make sure that she wakes up every single day. And as he is looking himself in the mirror in the bathroom, shaving, he says, today is not the day.
So that's a really good setup for the next question. You've talked about Taiwan as kind of the new Berlin in this geopolitical game. I'm really curious from a cyber perspective how you see this playing out. I guess for context, in the last 12, 24 months, we've seen an unprecedented amount of announcements from establishments, both from the United States, but also the Five Eye allies, around pre-positioning from Chinese campaigns around Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon into North American critical infrastructure. So you've got chess pieces moving around the board. If I look at the chess paraphernalia behind you, if there were to be something that happens with regards to Taiwan, how do you think that plays out from a cyber perspective?
Yeah. Well, cyber is actually one of those canaries in the coal mine that is telling us that things are going beyond just rhetoric and empty threats, and that China's preparing, right? About 4 to 5 years ago, China started launching this campaign that the U.S. government and industry calls Volt Typhoon, right? And it's fundamentally different from all the campaigns we've seen from them over the last 2 decades, where they've been infiltrating companies and governments and networks that have valuable information, right? State secrets or sensitive information or trade secrets, IP, etc. And in the case of Volt Typhoon, the target set is very different. They're now going after, a bank or Google or what have you. Other parts of Chinese espionage campaign are still trying to do all of that. But what they're doing is breaking into networks that have nothing valuable worth to steal. I'm talking like water utilities in the region, like Guam, right? Or small telecommunications providers there, or port facilities, or pipelines, small electric utilities. No valuable IP, but incredibly important critical infrastructure, particularly for the U.S. military that is operating in that region or is trying to mobilize troops to be sent to that region. And that is what the military calls preparation of the battlefield, right? This is getting access to those networks, learning how they operate, so that one day you can pull the plug, right, if the order is given. And that is done, the U.S. government believes, for 2 purposes. One, to try to impede the ability of the U.S. military to intervene in a conflict and rapidly deploy there. But 2, try to blackmail the United States into not supporting Taiwan by threatening to hold its power or water hostage, basically, and say that if you intervene, this will be much worse for you, not just on the military front in the region, but in terms of continental United States getting hit in a big way. So this is clearly China preparing for this conflict, right? And there's a bunch of stuff they're doing on the military side in terms of exercises and certain capabilities that they're building that is incredibly concerning as well. But cyber, should this conflict unfold, I think will play a very important role, not a central role, right? I was never a believer that cyber, is going to be the central element of warfare. At the end of the day, you win wars by occupying territory, killing your enemies. Can't really do any of that with cyber, but it's a supporting function that is very important. And it's played a fairly limited role in this conflict in Ukraine, some, but much less than I think most people expected. I think a conflict, should it occur, hopefully not, between the United States and China, cyber will play a much more important role. One, as I mentioned, on targeting the logistic backbone of the United States. We have, to travel 6,000 miles to get to the region. China is in its own backyard. So if they can hit our mobilization efforts and transportation efforts, that's going to be a huge coup for them. But secondly, our weapon systems are incredibly networked, right? The F-35 is basically a computer with wings, right? And it's highly reliant on a logistical system called Alice that's being replaced by another one called ODIN that lives on the internet on a sensitive but unclassified network that manages everything about that F-35 in terms of its maintenance schedule, spare parts, readiness levels, munitions, etc. And being able to compromise that system, being able to mess with the data in that system can dramatically impact the readiness of our F-35 squadrons. That's just one example of a potential cyber intrusion that doesn't make things go boom, but impacts logistics and readiness of the force, which is more important and which is how you can ultimately win wars, right? As the saying goes, amateurs focus on weapon systems, professionals focus on logistics. Logistics are incredibly important to warfare, and increasingly they're networked and vulnerable to cyber.
So you mentioned a little bit that the adversaries are now going into private networks, critical infrastructure, markets, etc. And certainly, you as well as others have been warning for years that private companies are now on the front lines of national security. Do you think that there's awareness and acceptance by those companies' CEOs that this is actually happening? Do they get it?
No, and this is another problem with these Typhoon campaigns is they're not targeting, Dominion Power, one of these large utilities that have, good cybersecurity teams, a lot of resources. They're targeting small utilities that don't even have a cyber team, barely have an IT guy who's probably part-time or gal. And do these people understand the threat of China? No. Have they spent any time thinking about it? No. Right? So this is the challenge that our underbelly is, particularly in the region, is these very, very small municipal utilities, energy, water, etc., that don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of sophistication, and at the same time play a very, very key role in American military power projection in that area of operations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's both the obvious critical infrastructure as well as what I would call the non-obvious critical infrastructure. We talk about national critical infrastructure like everybody kind of assumes that they understand what that is. But I was in Scandinavia last summer and talking to folks, literally just talking to folks on the street. There was pretty wide awareness of a series of cyber attacks which had taken down some of the grocery store chains in Scandinavia. Yeah. There was broad awareness and acceptance that, yeah, that was Russia. Of course that was Russia. Who else would it be? And so we think about critical infrastructure, but we don't necessarily think about, grocery stores, they're kind of important. We saw that with JBS Meats a couple of years ago, a large ransomware target, as well as others. So we've kind of covered a little bit around the defensive side. These are organizations that are being attacked by nation states, APTs, etc. I'm curious, what are your thoughts around the offensive side? So there's been some public reporting around offensive cyber operations that have taken place either from the United States or other Five Eye allies. But really, that's the sharp end of the stick. So do you think that the U.S. is being too careful with offensive cyber? Is it time to get more offensive, to show what's happening? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, I do think that we've been way too constrained on use of cyber operations because I think the policymakers have had a very distorted view of what this tool can and cannot do, right? I think there was a lot of hyperbole and unhelpful fear mongering on both defense and offense, that cyber can cause another 9/11 or cyber Pearl Harbor, all those analogies that were nonsense, right? And were scary on both sides of like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. We need to make sure we invest billions and billions of dollars in cyber defense. And then on the offense, we got to be super careful. God forbid we accidentally cause the same, right? And neither of those predictions was, of course, ever going to happen. It's very, very difficult to make things go boom in cyber, and usually you cause temporary disruption, but not permanent effects. And you look at the most famous cyber offense operations in history, whether it's Stuxnet, whether it's the campaign against Ukrainian energy going back to 2015, and certainly during this current war as well. Very, very fleeting effects, right? On Stuxnet in particular, the attack on the Iranian enrichment facilities, the best estimates I've seen is that it may have caused an 8-month delay in the program, and mostly not through overt disruption, but because of the psychological effect that the program had on convincing the Iranians that their centrifuges were defective, and they ended up destroying a lot of them themselves, right? But there's just limits to what you can do in cyber, and it's effective if you're trying to achieve a very specific thing for a very short period of time, and then you are able to leverage that. But in terms of long-term effects, very, very challenging, because of course the defender can always disconnect. But because of that fear, it also caused the U.S. policymakers to be very cautious about letting the cyber warriors, if you will, do whatever they wanted, because of the fear of like, oh my God, we're targeting an air defense system in Libya, and somehow we're going to take down a hospital. It was, of course, complete nonsense, because these operations are incredibly targeted. And by the way, you've got ransomware actors that are actually targeting hospitals every single day, right? Causing enormous damage, but society still survives, and a few people have died, but it's not been like the catastrophic disaster. And they're literally trying to do that, right? So the idea that the U.S. Cyber Command, in a very, very precise operation against a legitimate military target, is going to have some sort of cascading effects that are going to, cause societal-wide damage and violate Geneva Conventions and all the rest of it, was just absolutely nonsense, right? So there had to be a relaxation of what these folks could do. At the same time, you have to adjust your expectations what they can do, right? And that's where we've also had problems, where during the ISIS campaign, for example, the Pentagon told Cyber Command of, we need your cyber bombs. We've been spending billions of dollars on you guys. Now it's time to deliver. We're in a fight against these terrorists. Let's do it. And they've had fairly minor effect, and some in the intelligence community have even called it counterproductive, because they went after systems and networks and destroyed them that we were collecting on. And some people have made the case that it would have been better to collect on them so you can identify people and then target them, versus destroying their computers, right? Who knows what actually happened and who's right there, but it was a controversial operation. But it was also the wrong way to think about cyber, of like, these are cyber bombs, just like I have kinetic weapons that I can deploy. The right way to think about it is, what am I trying to achieve, and what are all the tools in my arsenal, from cyber to electronic warfare to kinetic platforms to covert action, that I can use to achieve that objective, right? And getting cyber deeply integrated into that is really the way to go. We will see if we get there, but this administration certainly has been speaking very openly about the need to unleash the cyber demons, and that defense has not worked, which I think is an accurate assessment. You can't just do defense against a persistent threat actor that has no cost to keep trying, right? One of the big fallacies, I think, of the last decade or so is people believe that there is such thing as deterrence by denial in cyber. That does not exist. In the deterrence framework more broadly, whether nuclear deterrence or conventional deterrence, you have two aspects of deterrence, right? Deterrence by punishment, right? You strike us, we'll strike you back. And deterrence by denial, which in the kinetic world means, for example, in the China context, they're trying to invade Taiwan and we sink their fleet in the Taiwan Strait and they're denied landing on the beaches of Taiwan and can't take it over, right? But in that particular case, it works because the fleet is gone. They can't try to do it again the next day. The capability is on the bottom of the ocean. You don't have that in cyber. Just because you block an attack doesn't mean that they now can't execute that attack again or have slight modifications to it. They can keep trying as long as they have time to do so. And ultimately, they'll succeed, right? So you can't have deterrence by denial in cyber. You can only have deterrence by punishment. And the administration believes that cyber can be a part of that punishment. We will see if they can be creative in applying it, because you do have this issue that there's a limit to the pain that you can cause in cyber. So how much can you really deter in the cyber domain alone is a big question.
Well, and there's an equities conversation too. I mean, how many O-days are you going to burn on a particular cyber operation that you're maybe holding on to in a cupboard?
Yeah, I think that matters a lot less. I think we've learned over the last 40, 50 years that the number of O-days is effectively unlimited, right? Because we're creating more vulnerabilities faster than we're patching them and identifying them. So there'll always be new ones. And the things that you need in war are likely to be much more specific to the kinetic fight, right? So you're not going to use your 0-day against Chinese integrated air defense on some sort of punishment campaign for cyber espionage, right? You're going to leave that for the military to use one day when you're in a real conflict, but you're going to look at, can we compromise some Huawei routers or some Windows systems that the Chinese have or whatever. So that type of stuff you can replenish really quickly.
Well, and interestingly enough, we've come full circle now. I mean, we started the conversation talking about the fact that this industry is never going to stay still and it's constantly changing. And here we are kind of reinforcing that. Dmitri, it's been an absolute pleasure. I so appreciate both this conversation, but also everything you've done to advance the cyber narrative and really create opportunities for companies like us. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to make one quick plug. One of the other things I've done since retiring from Crowdstrike is I'm very passionate that we need to build a new generation of professionals in this domain. Education is really important. I've been very dissatisfied for years in what academia was putting out in terms of professionals in this field, and how at Crowdstrike or at McAfee before then, the companies, I basically had to retrain people from scratch because what they learned was good theoretical background, but was not at all practical. So I founded an institute at Johns Hopkins Science School called the Paterson Institute of Cybersecurity Studies to make sure that we can build a very practical hands-on curriculum for graduate students that either want to extend their cyber education or want to get into the cyber field from scratch. And in addition to the professional professors that we have teaching it, who are some of the top people in the field, like Thomas Rid, who wrote the Active Measures book, one of the best academics in cyber domain, or Ben Buchanan, one of the leading AI thinkers and cyber thinkers, just came out of the White House, leading AI policy, but also a lot of adjuncts from companies like Facebook and Microsoft and Google and so forth that are providing very practical experience for students. So it's a great program for people that want to expand their education, but also if you are interested, you have to be in DC area, but if you're interested in being an adjunct, please get in touch, because we're always looking for people that want to give back and teach great, brilliant students how to be great cyber operators, cyber intelligence professionals, whole slew of professions that we have in this field.
Well, that's fantastic. The other one that I was going to say is for folks who maybe don't live cyber on a day-to-day basis like we do. I mean, the World on the Brink book does actually lay out a very compelling view into what's actually happening. What actually do cybersecurity companies defend against on a daily basis? And so certainly would recommend the book as well. Dmitri, I know that you're very prolific. People can find you in a bunch of different places, but what are one or two destinations that you'd like to direct people to?
Sure. Well, on social media, on X, D. Alperovitch, on Blue Sky, Silverado.org, and LinkedIn, and probably at a conference or bookstore near you. I'm still on the book tour, so happy to go talk to any audience about this really, really critical issue of our time, certainly of this decade, maybe the century, of this Cold War confrontation with China, and how do we win it, and how do we, most importantly, avoid a hot war that would be absolutely devastating in lives, in economy, in impact on everyone.
Fantastic. Dmitri, thank you so much.
Thank you.